Hello, and welcome to AP Computer Science A by Bizinstitution. Let's get started. So the first topic we'll be looking at is the Java skeleton and print statements. So the Java skeleton is basically what you could think of is where you run your code. The name next to the word class is my program, and that is basically the name of your file as well. So if it says public class paper, the Java file's name will also be paper. The name of the class and the file name of the Java file is the exact same. And this is the main method. You don't need to memorize it in any way. All you need to know, it is mandatory for running your code. So in many other programming languages, you might just start writing your code on a blank line. However, you cannot do that in Java. You need the public class file name as well as the main method. And inside these two lines, inside the main method is where you write most of your code. So let's look at print statements. A print statement is a function in Java. It is used to print a string to the console. So basically, the console, first of all, is where you think of it as where you output your code. So let's say you're writing all your code in the main method, as you can see here. But once you run it, you would expect it to see it somewhere. So when you run it, you see it in the console. For this course anyway, that is where your output will be for your code. So if you were to run something in the main method, it would show up in the console as your output. So a print statement is used to print a string. A string is basically a phrase or a sentence or a word. It can be anything. It's basically a text. It's basically a text, and it can be however long. So hello world is a string. New line is a string. This sentence, a print statement is a function in Java, is a string. So anything that has words, or just it can be numbers as well, enclosed in quotation marks, is a string. So there's two ways to print to the console. So what the printing to the console means is that it is a function that outputs to the console. So basically, this is the syntax, and inside the parentheses are what you call parameters. It outputs those parameters to the console. So hello world is a parameter, for example, and it outputs that to the console. So it's basically writing to the console. So the syntax is system.output.println. What it means is system is it's out, but out stands for output. So it is using the system to output to the console, which is a print statement. And there's two ways you can do this. You can do system.output.println or system.output.print. So the difference is println, as you may have imagined, is it prints to a new line. So system.output.println prints hello world. So as you can see in the console, it printed hello world. And then if I wrote a new line saying system.output.println new line, it printed a new line saying exactly this. However, if you don't have the ln keyword and just say system.output.print hello world, and then say system.output.print not a new line, all of that is on the same line. And as you can see, there's no space between world and not, because there's no space here and there's no space here. So it basically prints the entire thing in one line. So it prints this, and then it prints this, because the ln keyword is not present in this case. So there are two ways. You can print it on a new line or print it on the same line by the way you write the syntax. So the next thing we will be looking at is variables and data types. So here are the 5 most common data types in Java. So we already looked at string. It is basically a text. It represents a text. An example is programming is fun. That is a text, and it is enclosed in double quotes. Another similar example to a string is a char. It represents a character. However, the biggest difference is char can only have one character. If it exceeds more than one character, it cannot be a char. So char can only be one letter. So it can be A, or it can be C, or it can be X, or whatever letter. And the key difference between string and char is in single quotes, meanwhile string is in double quotes.
Okay, here's what I...
Also, int is an integer, so it can be negative or positive. I just chose a positive example. 65 is an integer, or 457 is an integer. So any number that is not a decimal is an integer. So as humans, we may look at decimals and whole numbers as still numbers. However, Java and most other coding languages view them as completely different data types. So a double is basically a decimal value. So 43.79 is a double because it is a decimal and it is not a whole number. And a Boolean is a true or false statement. We will be looking at Booleans in the future. However, all you need to know is Boolean can only hold two values, a true statement or a false statement. And an example of a Boolean is obviously true. One thing to keep in mind is that you cannot assign 43.79 to an int because 43.79 is not an integer, so it will throw an error. So all the data types have to be assigned to the same all the types have to be assigned to the same data type. And one last thing is that char, int, double, and boolean are primitive values. However, a string is an object. We will be looking at the difference between primitive values and objects in the future. So here's an example of more print statements. Initially, I showed you how print statements can print strings. This is not the case. It can also print any data type. So it can print. So the first example prints a string, hello world, but it also prints a boolean, true. It also prints an integer, 5, and it also prints a double, 5.75. So a print statement can print any data types and is not restricted to strings only. So what are variables? Variables are used to store/hold data types. Data types of a variable must be declared. The box analogy is used very frequently for variables. What the box analogy is that the name of the variable is written in permanent marker. However, the variable value is a paper slip. What this means is that let's say, as you can see in this example here, the name of the variable is new num. And the paper slip would be 5. So new num holds the value of 5. So you cannot change the variable name of the same variable. The variable name is fixed. If you change the name, it will be a completely new variable and it would not be the same box. However, since the value that is stored inside the box is just a paper slip, you can change it in the future. It doesn't have to be 5. It can be 10, as you can see in this example. So this is how variables are declared. The data type of the variable must be declared. So since 5 is an integer, you have to specify that it is an int. So you say int represents the data type. This new num is basically a name. It can be any name. That is just the name I decided to choose. And then you say equals 5 semicolon. 5 is the value that the variable new num holds. The new num is the name of the variable. You can see here another example. Int new num equals 5. And you can change the value of new num by saying new num equals 10. Now 5 no longer exists in new num. This paper slip is no longer 5. It goes away and a new paper slip is added as 10. So new num now stores the value of 10. And 5 is pretty much gone. And the final keyword, however, can be used so that variables cannot change their value. So if you use the final keyword, instead of a paper slip, you're writing inside the box. So if you say final int new num equals 5 and said new num equals 10, this would throw an error in the code because you cannot change the value of new num because of the final keyword. That is the final value of new num, and it cannot be changed. So as a quick review, the way you declare a variable is you declare the data type int, you declare the name, you write the name, it can be any name, and you say equals, and you type the value that the variable holds. So some quick variable naming rules. Variables must start with a $, underscore, or a letter. So numFruits or dollar sign numFruits is acceptable, but 5 apples is not acceptable because variables cannot start with a number. However, the rest of the variable name can have letters, numbers, or an underscore. So for example, numFruits 5. It starts with a letter, so it's fine. And then it's numFruits, and it has a 5, but it doesn't start with a number, so that's completely acceptable. It is good practice that programmers generally write variables in lower camel case. Camel case is basically that, let's say there's 3 words to this variable, lower camel case. Obviously, you cannot use spaces in variables, so what you do is you make the first letter of the first word lowercase, and then the second letter of the second word capital, the first letter of the first letter of the second word capital, and then the first letter of the third word capital, and so on. So the first letter of the first word will be lowercase, and then every word that the variable has, the first letter of that word will be a capital letter. Variable names are also case sensitive. For example, fruits 5 with a capital F and fruits 5 with a lowercase f are not the same exact variable. Arithmetic expressions. That's the next thing we'll be looking at. So you can actually do math in Java, and similarly to real world, plus means addition, minus means subtraction. We don't really have like a cross sign on our keyboard, so asterisk means multiplication, slash means division, and the percent sign means modulus. Now, what is modulus? Modulus, you probably know what addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division is, but you may not be familiar with modulus. However, modulus is very commonly used in programming. What it does, it outputs the remainder. So 22% 5 equals 2. Think about it this way. 22 divided by 5 is cannot be divided evenly. It will be a decimal value. But back when we were in second grade, so we did long division. So we did this method. 22 divided by 5 goes into 22 4 times. You subtract 20, and the remainder is 2. Basically, 22 modulus 5 is equal to 2. So it is basically the remainder of 22 divided by 5. Here are some examples. So I made a variable called int first num, and then I have another variable called int second num. The name of the first variable is first num. The name of the second variable is second num. So each variable has a value of 5. That doesn't mean this value of 5 and this value of 5 are the same. They're completely different. They just hold the same value, but they're completely different variables. So you can do arithmetic expressions. You can do arithmetic expressions and store it in a variable. For example, you can store first num plus second num into a variable called sum. Now the value of sum is 10, as you can see in the print statement. When I do system .output.println sum, it prints 10 because I did first num, which is the value of 5, plus second num, which has a value of 5, which equals 10. However, I don't have to store it in a variable to print it. As you can see in the rest of my examples, I did it directly in the parameters of the print statement. So you can just, in the parameter itself, you can say first num minus second num. There's a semicolon, but it got cut off by this scrolling bar, but there is a semicolon there. But yeah, each line ends with a semicolon. However, yeah, first num minus second num is 0 because 5 minus 5 is 0. first num asterisk or multiplication, first num times second num is 25 because 5 times 5 is 25. First num divided by second num is 1 because 5 divided by 5 is 1. And first num modulus second num is 0 because there is no remainder when you do 5 divided by 5 and the remainder is just 0. And this last line of code I have here is just to show that just like real life, Java follows order of operations. So in this case, it does the 10 plus 10 first because it is inside the parentheses, then multiplies with 5. So the answer to this equation right here would be 100 because 10 plus 10 is in the parentheses first, so 10 plus 10 is 20. 20 times 5 is 100, and that is what's printed in the console. One important thing we need to look at is integer division. 5 divided by 2 is not equal to 2.5. 5 divided by 2 is equal to 2 because 5 is an integer and 2 is an integer. So when you do 5 divided by 2, it cannot output a double. It will output an integer. So a lot of people might think, then shouldn't 5 divided by 2 output 3 because 2.5 rounded is 3. However, that's not how Java works. Java doesn't round the decimal. It simply truncates it. What that means is that everything after the decimal is vanished. It erases it and completely destroys it. Okay, not destroys it, but it completely gets rid of it. So 5 divided by 2 is 2 because everything after the decimal place is gone. Because 2.5, if you take out the decimal, it becomes 2. It's not intuitive, but Java technically doesn't round. It just gets rid of everything after the decimal place. However, you can simply fix this by doing 5.0 divided by 2.0, and that will output 2.5 because 5.0 is a double and 2.0 is a double, and so that will output 2.5. And both the values don't have to be an integer as long as one of the values in the division expression is a double. It will be a double. So 5.0 divided by 2, so it's a double divided by an integer. However, that will still output a double because it has a double. So as long as one of them have a double, one of the two numbers that are being divided have a double, the output will be a double or a decimal. So you can pause the video and look at these examples. They basically show show some examples of how integer division works. Each print statement corresponds to each output in the console. So there's 5 print statements and 5 outputs in the console. You can pause the video and look at it for more examples. So, what are compound assignment operators? Compound assignment operators are basically, you can increment values to a variable. So what if you want to increment values to the variable temp? So I created a variable called temp which holds the value of 5. What if I want to change that value and increment it or decrement it by a certain number? So let's say I want to increase the value of temp by 1. So increasing the value of temp by 1 would change it to 6. So temp equals temp plus 1 makes temp 6. So what it does is it says temp is equal to temp, which has the value of 5, and it adds the value of 1 to 5. So 5 plus 1 is now 6. Now temp stores the value of 6. So when you print temp to the console, it doesn't print 5. It prints 6 because it has been incremented. So programmers tend to be very lazy and they love shortcuts. And they got lazy of writing temp equals temp plus 1 every single time they want to increment 1 to a variable. So simply, temp plus plus does the same thing. So temp currently has a value of 6, but if you just write temp plus plus and print it, now the value of temp is 7. And it works the same way for decrementing the variable as well. You can simply do temp minus minus, and it subtracts the value of temp by 1, and now now the value of temp is decremented by 1, and the value of temp is back to 6. So what if you want to increment or decrement by more than 1? it is possible to do that. So I just picked a random number, 525. So you can do temp equals temp plus 525, temp equals temp minus 525. However, keep in mind that it is not limited to addition and subtraction. You can do it for multiplication, division, and modulus as well. And programmers love shortcuts a lot. They're very lazy. So you don't have to write this every time. You can, if you want to increment temp by 525, you can just say temp plus equals 525, or temp minus equals 525 to decrement temp by 525. Temp times equals 525 multiplies the value of temp by 525. So, and so on. It's the same for division and modulus as well. So the next thing we'll be looking at is user input. So here's some pre-code to user input before actually writing your code. So first, before the public class microprogram and the main method, you have to import this line right here. You import java.util.scanner. What this is that java.util is a package. Importing is very frequently used in Java because not everything is in the base Java package. So you import packages for whatever the purpose of your code is. So in this case, you're importing scanner, and what the scanner does is it takes user input. So before you do any of your code, you must do this. Scanner input equals new scanner system.in. You may have noticed this is extremely similar to declaring variables. Scanner is the type of object or the data type. However, in this case, it's an object, so it's not a primitive value. It is an object. So scanner is the data type, and the input is the name of the variable, and then then it is equals new scanner, and system.in is the input of the system, which is inside the parentheses of the scanner, which is the parameters. So we have this here, and how do we take input? Now that we have the scanner input equals new scanner system.in, how do we take input? So there are three ways to take input. You can either take a string input, an integer input, or double input. And all of these are done using the .next keyword. To take the input of a string, you do string text equals input.nextLine. Text is just a variable name that I decided to choose. It can be anything. But what's the main thing we need to look at is input.nextLine, input.nextInt, and input.nextDouble. So input.nextLine takes a string input, input.nextInt takes an integer input, and input.nextDouble takes a double input. One thing you may have noticed is that primitive values are lowercase. So int and double are primitive values, and they are lowercase. Scanner and string are objects, and they're almost always uppercase. So here's an example of user input in action. So scanner input equals new scanner system.in. That is the base code. Keep in mind that java.util.scanner is already imported. And I have a print statement saying, what is your name? And what it does is user input for the scanner is taken in the console itself. So the user inputs it in the console. So the console is not only used for output, it can also be used for input. So when I write a print statement saying, what is your name? I have a string name saying input.nextLine. What that does is it takes an input of the whatever I type in the next line and stores it in the variable name. And then I simply have a blank line, and I have another question. String system.output.println, how old are you? And the code is asking me how old am I? And in this case, I said 17. Basically saying, but this time I use input.nextInt because it's taking an integer. You can take string, but integer is better because you may use calculations further in your code. So I said input.nextInt and stored it in the value variable age. So 17 is stored in the value age because I inputted it into the console. And when you print name and age to the console, it shows that Varshit is 17 years old. So the last thing we will be looking at is casting. Don't worry, we're almost done, and I only have one slide left, as casting is a very simple topic. So what if we want to store the value of number, which is 7.0, which is a double, but I want to store it as an integer? I can't simply say int variable name equals number. I can't say that because that will throw an error, because you cannot store a double in an integer. So what you do is you say int variable name, I just said number as int, equals, cast it into a now integer. So casting means you put the data type you want to cast it into, so in this case int, and you put that into parentheses next to the variable type. So you're casting the value of number, which is a double, you're casting it as an integer using this syntax right here, and storing it as an integer variable. And if you look in this case, when you print number, it is a double, and when you print number as int, it is an integer. Thank you.